Jack stood in the heart of the forest, the cold, damp air clinging to his skin like an unshakable presence. The towering trees around him reached into the gray sky, their bare branches clawing at the heavens, as if in silent protest. The forest was ancient, a place untouched by time, and it held an eerie silence, as though it knew what was about to transpire. The only sound that broke the quiet was the labored, uneven breathing of the massive bear, lying motionless at the base of an oak tree. The bear had once been a fearsome creature, its hulking frame a symbol of untamed power and resilience. But now, it was reduced to a pathetic shadow of its former self. Its fur, once sleek and glistening, was now matted and patchy, marked with blood from old wounds that had never properly healed. Its powerful limbs, capable of tearing through prey with ease, trembled with the weight of exhaustion. Each breath it took was a wheezing struggle, its body rising and falling with a feeble rhythm that betrayed how close it was to the edge of life. Jack, however, was unmoved by the sight before him. He was a man of sharp, angular features, his eyes cold and unfeeling as they surveyed the scene. His thick gloves creaked as he tightened the ropes that bound the bear to the tree, the fibers cutting cruelly into the creature's flesh. Jack had dragged the bear here, deep into the wilderness, for one purpose: to leave it to die. It wasn't enough to simply abandon it. He wanted the forest to finish the job for him. The wolves, he knew, would come. They always did. The thought brought a smirk to his lips. The bear let out a weak moan, a sound that once might have echoed with authority, but now quivered with desperation. Its eyes, deep and dark, gazed at Jack with a mix of confusion and pleading, as if trying to understand why the man who had hunted it so relentlessly was now condemning it to such a fate. Jack ignored the bear's gaze, finding no remorse within himself. To him, the bear was a failure. It was no longer the prize he had envisioned, a robust and ferocious beast to mount as a trophy. Its weakened state disgusted him, and he saw no value in sparing it. He stepped back, his boots crunching against the frosty forest floor. His breath came out in visible puffs, the cold biting at his face, but Jack barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the bear and the scene he had created. The ropes were knotted tightly, looping around the thick trunk of the oak tree and pinning the bear's limbs in place. It could barely move, let alone attempt an escape. The knots were the product of years of practice. Jack was a skilled hunter, and his expertise showed in the deliberate precision of his work. The forest seemed to close in around them, the silence growing heavier. Jack was acutely aware of the stillness, as though the very air was holding its breath. He glanced around, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. The wolves would come soon, he thought. He had chosen this spot carefully, knowing it was part of their territory. He could already imagine them slinking through the underbrush, their glowing eyes fixed on the helpless bear, their fangs bared in anticipation of the feast. Jack felt a flicker of satisfaction at the thought. Overhead, a murder of crows had begun to gather, their black forms stark against the pale sky. They perched on the highest branches, their beady eyes watching the scene below with a predatory curiosity. Their caws rang out intermittently, harsh and discordant, as if they too were condemning the bear to its fate. Jack looked up at them, his expression unreadable. "You'll have your turn," he muttered under his breath, his voice low and rough. The crows seemed to respond with a chorus of cries, their calls echoing through the stillness. The bear made another sound, a guttural noise that was half growl, half whimper. It struggled weakly against its bonds, its muscles twitching as it tried to summon the strength to resist. But it was no use. The ropes held firm, and the bear's attempts only seemed to drain what little energy it had left. Jack watched with detached amusement, his arms crossed over his chest. He could see the life draining from the animal with every passing moment, its breaths growing shallower, its movements slower. It was a spectacle to him, a grim testament to the harshness of nature, a harshness he considered himself a part of. The light in the forest began to shift as the afternoon wore on, the sun dipping lower in the sky and casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping steadily, but Jack didn't leave. He lingered, leaning against a nearby tree, his expression one of smug satisfaction. This was his victory, his moment of dominance over the wild. The bear was nothing more than a symbol now, a reminder of his power and control. He reveled in it, unbothered by the cruelty of his actions. As the first distant howl rang out, Jack straightened, a slow smile spreading across his face. The wolves were coming. The sound was faint, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was followed by another howl, closer this time, and then another. The chorus grew louder, more insistent, as the pack began to converge on the area. Jack felt a surge of excitement, his heart beating a little faster. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had no intention of staying to witness the wolves tear into the bear. He wasn't sentimental enough for that. But the knowledge that it would happen, that the forest would finish what he had started, was enough for him. He stepped forward one last time, looking down at the bear. Its eyes were half closed now. Its body slumped against the tree as if it had finally accepted its fate. Jack crouched down, his face inches from the animal's. "This is the end for you," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You weren't strong enough to survive. That's how the world works." With that, he stood and turned away, his boots crunching loudly as he began to walk back through the forest. He didn't look back, not even as the bear let out one final, pitiful moan that seemed to hang in the air long after it had faded. The crows cawed louder, their cries following Jack as he disappeared into the shadows. The forest, once silent, was now alive with the sounds of the approaching wolves and the restless birds. By the time Jack reached the edge of the woods, the forest behind him was filled with the distant echoes of growls and snarls. The wolves had arrived, and the bear's fate was sealed. Jack stepped out of the trees and into the open, the cold wind biting at his face. He felt no regret, no second thoughts. To him, this was just another day, another victory in his endless battle against the wild. Nightfall blanketed the forest in an oppressive darkness, pierced only by faint slivers of moonlight that filtered through the towering trees. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air carried a stillness so deep that even the faint rustling of leaves felt intrusive. Somewhere deep within this ancient, untamed wilderness, the bound bear lay slumped against the oak tree, barely alive. Its labored breathing was shallow, its immense body limp and unresponsive. A fine mist escaped from its nostrils with every weak exhale, vanishing into the icy air. The forest, though quiet, was not at peace. It was the kind of silence that bristled with anticipation, a heavy, intangible tension that warned of unseen dangers lurking just beyond the veil of darkness. Then, from the distance, came the sound that broke the stillness, a solitary howl. It was long, haunting, and deliberate, carrying across the expanse of the forest like a call to arms. The bear stirred faintly, its ear twitching in response. Though it was barely conscious, its instincts stirred, a primal warning deep within, whispering of imminent peril. Another howl followed, closer this time, sharper and more urgent. Soon, the forest seemed alive with the eerie symphony of wolves calling to each other, their voices weaving together into an intricate and coordinated pattern. They were assembling. They had found their prey. The sounds grew louder as the pack moved closer, their howls cutting through the air in perfect harmony with the snapping of twigs and the soft rustling of underbrush. The wolves were not clumsy in their approach. They were careful, deliberate, almost methodical. They were skilled hunters, their every movement calculated to maintain their advantage. Their glowing eyes appeared first, glinting like pale gold in the shadows. Then their forms emerged, sleek and muscular, moving with the predatory grace of creatures built for the hunt. The lead wolf, a massive alpha with a coat of steel-gray fur that gleamed in the faint moonlight, stepped into the clearing first. Its eyes locked immediately onto the bear, its nostrils flaring as it took in the scent of blood, sickness, and weakness. Behind it, the rest of the pack began to fan out, encircling the tree where the bear lay bound. Their movements were almost soundless, their paws barely disturbing the frosted ground. The bear let out a low groan, a guttural and pitiful sound that carried none of the power it once wielded. The wolves hesitated for a moment, their ears twitching at the sound. The younger wolves bared their teeth, eager to lunge, but the alpha held them back with a low growl. It wasn't ready to give the signal to attack. The pack moved closer, the circle tightening around the bear. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, their lips pulled back to reveal rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. And yet, despite the overwhelming advantage of numbers and the vulnerability of their prey, they did not strike. Something held them back, something intangible but deeply rooted in their primal instincts. The alpha stepped closer to the tree, lowering its head to sniff the ground around the bear. It took in every detail of the scene, the unnatural stillness of the bound creature, the ropes cutting into its fur, the faint traces of a human scent lingering on the tree trunk. The alpha's ears twitched, its head jerking upward as it scanned the surrounding darkness. Its hackles rose slightly, the fur along its spine bristling with unease. The other wolves mirrored their leader's reaction, their bodies tensing as they sniffed the air. One of the younger wolves, a lithe and impulsive creature with dark fur, stepped closer to the bear. It let out a sharp bark, testing the situation, and then snapped its jaws in a show of dominance. The bear barely reacted, its head lolling weakly to one side. The younger wolf whined softly, backing away again as if sensing that something wasn't right. The pack's behavior shifted subtly. The eagerness that had marked their arrival began to fade, replaced by a growing tension that rippled through the group like an unspoken warning. The wolves exchanged nervous glances, their ears swiveling toward the darkness beyond the clearing. The alpha growled again, louder this time, its voice filled with an edge of warning rather than command. The forest, so still just moments before, now felt alive with an invisible presence. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, their ancient roots and branches whispering secrets to one another. The wolves could feel it, a weight in the air that pressed down on them with an almost physical force. It wasn't just the bear that occupied their attention now. It was something else, something unseen, but unmistakably there. The younger wolves shifted uneasily, their movements jittery and uncertain. One of them, a smaller female with a patchy white coat, let out a soft whimper, her tail curling under her body as she backed away from the circle. Even the older, more seasoned members of the pack seemed affected, their eyes darting nervously toward the edges of the clearing. The shadows beyond the trees seemed deeper than before, as if they were hiding something more significant than darkness. The alpha remained still, its sharp gaze fixed on the horizon. It let out a low, rumbling growl that silenced the pack, a sound that communicated both authority and unease. The wolf's instincts, honed through countless hunts, screamed caution. It wasn't fear that held the pack back. It was the sense that they were not alone in the forest tonight. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity as the standoff continued. The wolves paced the clearing, their movements slow and deliberate, their ears constantly swiveling toward the slightest sound. The air grew heavier, colder, the silence broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or the faint rustle of leaves. The bear, still tied to the tree, seemed almost forgotten. Its shallow breaths came and went, its body too weak to react to the wolves circling around it. It was as if the predator and prey dynamic had shifted, the bear no longer the central focus of the scene. The wolves weren't hunting anymore. They were waiting, their attention divided between the helpless creature before them and the oppressive presence they could feel but not see. The alpha let out a final growl, a deep and resonant sound that seemed to echo through the clearing. It was a signal, not to attack, but to retreat. Slowly, the pack began to back away, their glowing eyes never leaving the bear. They moved as one, their bodies low to the ground, their muscles coiled and ready to spring at the first sign of danger. The clearing emptied as silently as it had filled, the wolves disappearing one by one into the shadows of the forest. The bear remained, slumped against the tree, alone once more. But the forest was not at peace. The wolves had left not out of fear of the bear, but because they had sensed something greater, something unknown that had staked its claim on the night. The clearing was still, but the air bristled with an unspoken threat, a promise that the forest's true master had yet to reveal itself. The forest lay cloaked in silence, a silence so deep it seemed unnatural. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and refused to leave. The moon hung high, its pale light filtering through the skeletal branches and casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing where the weak bear lay. Its massive form, once a symbol of strength, was slumped lifelessly against the unyielding oak, the thick ropes biting into its matted fur. It barely breathed, each ragged exhale a misty whisper in the freezing air. The wolves had gone, their retreat swift and sudden, driven by instincts they couldn't fully understand. But the fear that had gripped them lingered, seeping into the stillness of the night like a shadow that refused to be banished. The weak bear, though too broken to move, could feel it too. Even in its fading consciousness, it sensed the presence of something vast, something ancient and terrible moving through the forest. The tension hung heavy in the clearing, pressing down like an invisible weight. The wind, barely more than a whisper, stirred the brittle leaves scattered across the ground. It carried with it a scent, faint but unmistakable. The weak bear's nostrils flared, and for the first time in hours, its dull eyes opened slightly, a flicker of recognition glimmering within them. The scent was familiar, a lifeline buried deep in its primal memory. And then it came. From the darkness of the trees, a shape began to emerge. At first, it was little more than a shadow, moving with a grace and silence that seemed impossible for something so large. The clearing seemed to shrink in its presence, the trees bowing as though in deference to the creature that stepped into the moonlight. It was a bear, but not just any bear. This was a giant, towering over even the largest predators that roamed the forest. Its fur, a rich dark brown that shimmered faintly in the silver light, was thick and unblemished, a stark contrast to the ragged pelt of the weak bear. Its eyes burned with an intelligence and intensity that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the night. The giant bear moved slowly, deliberately, each step a calculated act of power. The ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight, the vibrations reverberating through the clearing. Its gaze swept over the scene, taking in the weak bear, the ropes, the faint lingering scent of the wolves. A low, rumbling growl escaped its throat, a sound so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. This forest belonged to it, and any who dared challenge its dominion would pay the price. The weak bear let out a faint whimper, its body trembling as the giant approached. But there was no fear in its eyes, only a flicker of hope. The giant bear paused a few feet away, towering over the pitiful figure bound to the tree. For a moment, it stood still, its massive head lowering as it examined the ropes. Its growl deepened, a sound that made the very air vibrate with raw power. The ropes, so meticulously tied by Jack, seemed like little more than strings in the presence of such a creature. With a single powerful swipe of its paw, the giant bear struck the ropes. The fibers snapped instantly, fraying and falling away like dry grass. The weak bear slumped forward, its body collapsing to the ground in a heap. It let out a low groan, its battered frame too feeble to support itself. The giant bear nudged it gently with its massive snout, a surprisingly tender gesture that seemed almost out of place for a creature of its size and strength. The weak bear stirred faintly, its eyes meeting the burning gaze of its rescuer. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The giant bear growled again, this time softer, almost as though speaking to the injured creature. The weak bear responded with a faint rumble, a sound filled with exhaustion, but also trust. Slowly, the giant bear lowered itself to the ground, its enormous body creating a protective shield around the other. Its presence radiated warmth, a stark contrast to the icy air that clung to the forest like a shroud. But the night was not over. The wolves had fled, but their howls echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder that the danger had not entirely passed. The pack was restless, their instincts conflicted between hunger and the overwhelming sense of dread that the giant bear had instilled in them. The alpha paced at the edge of the clearing, its golden eyes fixed on the shadows where the giant had appeared. It barked sharply, its voice cutting through the night like a knife. The other wolves hesitated, their bodies tense, their movements uncertain. They wanted the bear, but they feared what stood between them and their prey. The giant bear seemed to sense this. It lifted its head, its ears twitching as it listened to the distant howls. Slowly, it rose to its full height, its massive frame blotting out the moonlight. It let out a roar, a sound so powerful, so earth-shaking, that it seemed to split the night in two. The sound carried for miles, its echo rebounding off the distant hills and sending a clear message to anything that dared listen. This forest was not a place for challengers. The wolves scattered, their courage shattered by the sheer force of the sound. Even the alpha, which had held its ground the longest, turned and fled, its tail low as it disappeared into the darkness. The clearing fell silent once more, the air thick with the scent of fear and power. The giant bear turned its attention back to the weak one. Gently, it nudged the injured creature again, urging it to stand. The weak bear struggled, its limbs shaking as it tried to rise. After a few agonizing moments, it managed to get to its feet, leaning heavily against the larger bear for support. The giant bear growled softly, a sound filled with reassurance. Together, they began to move, the smaller bear stumbling with each step but pressing on under the watchful guidance of its protector. As they disappeared into the forest, the clearing was left empty, the rope fragments scattered across the ground, the only evidence of what had occurred. The night was still, but the echoes of the giant bear's roar lingered, a testament to the power that had reclaimed its domain. And somewhere, far away, Jack remained oblivious, his cruel plan unraveling as the forest itself intervened. The forest was heavy with silence, save for the faint sounds of brittle leaves crunching under heavy paws. The moon hung low in the sky now, its light softened, as if weary of illuminating the pain and struggle below. The massive bear moved slowly but deliberately, its great frame towering over the frail creature beside it. The weak bear, still trembling from exhaustion and pain, had managed to rise on unsteady legs with the giant's help, but every step seemed like an impossible task. The giant bear paused, turning its immense head toward the sick bear, nudging it gently with its snout. The motion wasn't violent or impatient, but it carried weight, a command to keep moving. The smaller bear groaned, its muscles quivering as it tried to take another step. Its paws sank into the frozen earth, but the rest of its body seemed unwilling to cooperate. Its front legs buckled, and it collapsed heavily onto its side, letting out a low, broken moan of defeat. The giant bear didn't stop. It stood over the collapsed figure, watching for a moment, its eyes burning with a mix of impatience and resolve. Then, with an almost parental firmness, it prodded the weak bear's ribs with a massive paw, urging it to rise. The sick bear flinched, its breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. It didn't want to move. It couldn't. Every fiber of its body screamed for rest, for the cold ground to swallow it whole and end the struggle. But the giant bear wasn't letting it give up. A growl, low and guttural, rumbled from the giant bear's chest, not a threat but a warning. It leaned down, its snout pressing against the weak bear's shoulder, then nudged it harder this time. The force nearly rolled the smaller bear onto its stomach. The weak bear growled weakly in protest, a pitiful sound that lacked any real fight. Still, it managed to lift its head, its glassy eyes meeting the giant's burning gaze. There was no pity in those eyes, only a command move. The weak bear tried again. Its legs shook violently as it pushed itself up, its claws scraping against the frozen ground for purchase. The giant bear stayed close, its bulk a looming wall of reassurance, or perhaps pressure. Slowly, Agonizingly, the sick bear got to its feet. It swayed dangerously, its head hanging low, but it was standing. The giant bear stepped forward, nudging the smaller one again, this time directing it toward the dense forest ahead. The weak bear staggered, dragging one paw after the other in uneven, clumsy movements. Every step seemed to sap what little strength it had left, but it kept moving, driven by the relentless presence of its towering rescuer. As they moved deeper into the forest, the trees grew closer together, their skeletal branches forming a labyrinth of shadows. The ground was uneven, scattered with roots and stones that threatened to trip the weak bear with every step. The giant bear navigated the terrain effortlessly, its massive paws silent against the forest floor, but the smaller bear struggled. More than once, it stumbled, falling hard against the earth with a pained grunt. Each time, the giant bear stopped, its patience unyielding. It would stand over the collapsed figure, waiting a moment before nudging, prodding, and growling softly until the weak bear rose again. The process repeated itself over and over, a cycle of collapse, encouragement, and reluctant progress. The weak bear's fur was caked with dirt and frost, its sides heaving as it fought for breath. The humiliation of its helplessness hung over it like a shroud, but the giant bear didn't allow it to linger in despair. It didn't allow it to stop. Hours seemed to pass in this torturous rhythm. The weak bear's movements became slower, its body sagging more with each fall. But the giant bear remained unwavering, never leaving its side. When the smaller bear faltered, the giant would press its body against it, lending its strength as a crutch. When the weak bear hesitated, the giant would growl, low and commanding, and nudge it forward. The forest grew darker as they pressed on, the faint glow of the moon obscured by thick clouds. The cold became more biting, the wind picking up and whistling through the trees like a mournful tune. The weak bear shivered violently, its body no longer able to hold warmth. Seeing this, the giant bear stopped, lowering itself to the ground beside the smaller one. It pressed its massive frame against the sick bear, shielding it from the wind and offering what warmth it could. For a moment, the weak bear slumped against the larger one, its ragged breaths slowing as it soaked in the heat radiating from the giant's body. The smaller bear's eyes closed, its head drooping as if sleep would claim it. But the giant bear didn't allow that either. It growled sharply, nudging the weak bear upright again. Rest could come later. Now they needed to move. The weak bear groaned in frustration, its exhaustion bleeding into every sound it made. But it obeyed. It struggled to its feet once more, leaning heavily against the giant bear's side for support. Together, they moved forward, their forms weaving through the dense forest like shadows. At last, the trees began to thin, and the faint sound of running water reached their ears. The weak bear's head lifted slightly at the sound, its instincts stirring despite its broken state. The giant bear seemed to sense the change, its pace quickening as it guided the smaller bear toward the source. They emerged into a small clearing where a narrow stream cut through the frost-covered earth. The water sparkled faintly in the dim light, its gentle gurgle a soothing contrast to the harsh silence of the forest. The giant bear nudged the weak one toward the water, growling softly. The smaller bear hesitated, its legs trembling, but the promise of relief was too strong to resist. It staggered to the edge of the stream, lowering its head to lap at the icy water. The first taste sent a shiver through the weak bear's body, but it drank deeply, the cold liquid soothing its parched throat. The giant bear stood nearby, watching with a silent intensity. It didn't drink. It simply stood guard, its massive form a barrier between the weak bear and the world. For the first time since the ordeal began, the weak bear seemed to find a small spark of strength. Its trembling subsided slightly, its breathing steadied. It lifted its head, water dripping from its snout, and looked at the giant bear. There was still no pity in the giant's eyes, but there was something else, perhaps the faintest hint of approval. The weak bear turned its gaze back to the forest ahead, its posture still sagging but less defeated. The giant bear growled softly, stepping forward and nudging it onward. There was no time to rest, no room for complacency. The journey wasn't over, and the giant bear wasn't finished teaching the weak one how to survive. Together, they disappeared into the darkness once more, their forms swallowed by the forest, but the weak bear's steps were just a little stronger now. The forest was cold and damp as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the trees in a pale, lifeless gray. Jack trudged through the underbrush, his boots crushing the frost-covered leaves underfoot. His breath puffed out in visible clouds, the chill of the early morning biting at his face and fingers despite the thick gloves he wore. He moved with a sense of purpose, his rifle slung across his back and his knife strapped firmly at his hip. He was returning to the clearing where he had left the bear tied the night before, eager to confirm that the wolves had done their work. Jack's mood was confident, even smug. He envisioned the scene awaiting him, the scattered remains of the pathetic creature, a testament to the ruthlessness of nature and, by extension, his own cunning. He imagined the gnawed bones and the bloody patches on the ground where the wolves had feasted, and a cruel smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. For Jack, this was more than just about eliminating the weak. It was about the satisfaction of dominance, the knowledge that he had orchestrated this grim fate. The forest was quiet, unnervingly so. The usual morning sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by a silence that pressed down on Jack like an invisible weight. The deeper he ventured into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The towering trees loomed over him, their skeletal branches stretching skyward like bony fingers. Jack felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, but he dismissed it as nothing more than the lingering chill of the morning air. He reached the edge of the clearing, pausing briefly to take in the sight before him. But instead of the scene of carnage he had expected, the clearing was empty. The oak tree where the bear had been tied stood stark and solitary, its bark scarred where the ropes had bitten into it. The ropes themselves lay in frayed pieces on the ground, scattered as though they had been torn apart by some unimaginable force. There was no sign of the bear or the wolves. Jack frowned, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. Something wasn't right. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching against the frost as he approached the tree. He crouched down, picking up one of the rope fragments and turning it over in his hands. The fibers were shredded, not chewed, and the cuts were too clean to have been made by the teeth of wolves. A sense of unease began to creep into Jack's mind, but he pushed it aside. Wolves could be unpredictable, he reasoned. Maybe they had dragged the bear's body away to feast in private. But even as he tried to convince himself, the forest felt wrong. The silence was suffocating, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Jack stood slowly, his eyes darting to the shadows that surrounded the clearing. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before, deeper and more menacing than the growl of any wolf. Jack froze, his body tensing instinctively as his hand moved to the hilt of his knife. The growl came again, louder this time, and it was followed by the sound of something massive moving through the underbrush. Branches snapped, and the ground trembled faintly under the weight of heavy footsteps. Jack's pulse quickened as his eyes locked onto the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Slowly, deliberately, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as it stepped into the weak morning light, Jack's breath caught in his throat. The bear that stood before him was enormous, far larger than any he had ever encountered. Its dark brown fur gleamed faintly with moisture, and its eyes burned with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. This was no ordinary bear. It was a giant, a creature that radiated power and dominance with every movement. The scars on its body, faint but visible, told a story of battles won and foes vanquished. It was an apex predator in every sense, and it was staring directly at Jack. Jack took an involuntary step back, his bravado crumbling in the face of the creature's sheer presence. He gripped the hilt of his knife tightly, but his hand was shaking. The bear growled again, the sound so deep and resonant that it seemed to echo inside Jack's chest. It took a step forward, its massive paws pressing into the frost-covered ground with a weight that seemed to shake the earth itself. Jack's mind raced. He had hunted countless animals in his life, but nothing had ever made him feel the way this bear did. There was no way he could fight it, not with a knife, not even with his rifle. This was something beyond him, something primal and untouchable. For the first time in years, Jack felt fear, real, bone-deep fear. The bear didn't charge. It didn't need to. It advanced slowly, each step deliberate and measured, its eyes never leaving Jack. The message was clear: leave. Jack's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, pride and arrogance battling against the primal urge to survive. The bear let out a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to shake the entire forest. Jack stumbled back, his knife falling from his hand and landing with a dull thud on the ground. The sound jolted him into action, and he turned, stumbling and tripping over his own feet as he fled into the trees. The forest seemed to close in around him as he ran, the shadows twisting and shifting as though mocking his retreat. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. Behind him, the bear's growl rumbled again, a sound that carried both a warning and a promise. It didn't pursue him. It didn't need to. The humiliation of his retreat was enough. Jack didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the forest, his body trembling and drenched in sweat despite the cold. He collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His mind replayed the encounter over and over. The image of the giant bear burned into his memory. For the first time, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years: small, helpless, defeated. The forest, now quiet again, seemed to watch him as he lay there, broken and humiliated. The giant bear had made its point. This was its domain, and Jack was no longer welcome. The weak bear stood in the quiet clearing, its legs trembling beneath its own weight. The frostbitten air still clung to the forest, and the sunlight breaking through the trees did little to warm the earth. Its breath came in ragged, visible bursts, each exhale a reminder of how close it had been to death. But despite the pain, the exhaustion, and the overwhelming urge to collapse, the bear was alive. Somehow, against all odds, it had survived. The giant bear stood nearby, its imposing form still as it observed the smaller creature. Its sharp, intelligent eyes didn't waver, nor did its massive frame betray any sign of retreat. It had brought the weak bear to this point, not by offering it comfort, but by demanding its strength, forcing it to rise and endure. There was no pity in the giant's gaze, only a cold understanding of what survival required. The weak bear lowered its head to the stream, drinking deeply from the icy water that flowed over the rocks. The liquid burned its throat at first, the chill shocking its weakened body, but it didn't stop. The water carried life, a spark that reignited something dormant within. The bear's sides heaved as it drank, the tension in its body gradually lessening. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, it felt the faintest ember of relief. The giant bear growled softly, a low and resonant sound that carried no threat but served as a reminder. The journey wasn't over. The weak bear lifted its head slowly, water dripping from its snout. It swayed on its feet, unsteady but upright. The weight of its exhaustion was immense, pressing down on its fragile body like a mountain, but the growl stirred something primal within, a refusal to collapse again, a need to keep moving. The giant bear stepped closer, its movements deliberate and measured. It leaned its massive head down, nudging the smaller bear with its nose. The weak bear stumbled but caught itself, its claws digging into the frosty earth for stability. The giant growled again, firmer this time, and began walking toward the dense forest beyond the stream. It didn't look back, trusting the smaller bear to follow. The weak bear hesitated, its legs still shaking with each step, but the presence of the giant seemed to anchor it. It began to move, slowly and clumsily, dragging its battered body after the larger creature. Each step was a struggle, its muscles screaming in protest, but it pressed forward, driven by the unspoken demand of the bear that had saved it. Survival was no longer an option, it was an expectation. The two bears moved deeper into the forest, leaving the stream and clearing behind. The terrain grew more challenging, the ground uneven and littered with fallen branches and patches of icy mud. The weak bear stumbled frequently, its body slumping to the ground in fits of exhaustion. But the giant bear was relentless, circling back each time the smaller bear fell, nudging it to its feet with a mixture of patience and insistence. There was no mercy in its actions, only an understanding that rest could not be afforded. Not yet. As the hours passed, the weak bear began to find a rhythm in its movements. The initial agony of each step dulled to a throbbing ache, and its trembling limbs grew slightly steadier. It was far from strong, but it was alive, and for now that was enough. The giant bear led the way with unwavering purpose, navigating the labyrinth of trees with an ease that bordered on instinct. The weak bear followed closely, its focus entirely on placing one paw in front of the other. The forest began to change as they ventured deeper. The frost that clung to the ground gave way to patches of exposed earth, and the air grew slightly warmer, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp moss. The weak bear's ears twitched as it picked up the distant calls of birds, a reminder that life thrived even in the harshest of places. The giant bear paused briefly, tilting its head as it listened to the forest around them. It seemed to be searching for something, its sharp gaze scanning the trees with a clarity that suggested purpose. Finally, they emerged into a small, secluded glade. The sunlight that filtered through the canopy above painted the clearing in golden hues, and the ground was soft and covered in a thick carpet of moss. A cluster of berry bushes lined one edge of the glade, their deep red fruit a stark contrast to the surrounding greenery. The giant bear stepped aside, allowing the weak bear to stumble forward into the clearing. The weak bear collapsed almost immediately, its body sinking into the moss with a muffled thud. It lay still, its sides heaving as it gasped for breath. The giant bear watched silently, its expression unreadable, before stepping closer to the berry bushes. With a single swipe of its massive paw, it knocked a cluster of berries loose, scattering them onto the ground. It turned, nudging the berries toward the weak bear with its nose. The smaller bear opened its eyes slowly, its gaze falling on the fruit. Hunger stirred within it, a gnawing ache that had been overshadowed by exhaustion but was now impossible to ignore. It pushed itself up weakly, leaning forward to sniff the berries before tentatively biting into one. The burst of sweetness on its tongue was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the bitterness it had endured for so long. It ate slowly, savoring each berry as though it were a feast. The giant bear didn't move as the smaller bear ate, standing guard at the edge of the glade. Its ears swiveled constantly, attuned to the faintest sound that might signal danger. It had brought the weak bear here, to a place of safety, but the forest was never truly free of threats. The giant bear knew this, and it remained vigilant, its massive frame a silent protector. As the weak bear finished the berries, it leaned back on its haunches, its body sagging with relief. For the first time in days, it felt something other than pain satisfaction. Its strength was still meager, its body battered and frail, but it was alive. The giant bear turned its head, its piercing eyes meeting the smaller bear's gaze. There was no approval in its expression, only expectation. The weak bear understood. This was not an end, but a beginning, a second chance, hard-earned and fleeting. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the glade. The weak bear rose shakily to its feet, its legs still unsteady, but its resolve stronger than before. It turned to the giant bear, waiting for its next move. The larger bear growled softly, a sound that seemed to say, "Keep going." Without hesitation, it began to walk toward the trees at the edge of the clearing, its movements fluid and purposeful. The weak bear followed, its steps slow but determined. The glade faded behind them as they disappeared once more into the vast, unyielding wilderness. The forest closed around them, but for the first time, the weak bear didn't feel lost. It had been given a second chance, and though the journey ahead was uncertain, it was moving forward, one step at a time.